We left off near the end of the book of Judges with the case of Samson, who is a Nazirite. I was saying a Nazirite was a means of getting into the clergy in the biblical world if you weren't the son of a priest. And the story was that Samson is not your typical Nazirite. He doesn't swear a vow to become one. It is there was a divine revelation to his mother while she's pregnant that he is to be a Nazirite from the womb. And so instead of his not drinking alcohol all his life, it is the mother who doesn't. And he is never forbidden to touch corpses the way other Nazirites are. And he does have the loose hair of a Nazirite. Now, all those things are key to what's going to happen in his life. He's not forbidden to be with women either, which is important because women are going to determine everything that happens in his life. Right? He turns against the Philistines not because they're the enemy and not because he's dedicated to God and the people of Israel and all that. He turns against the Philistines because his wife's a Philistine and her family takes her away from him. And so then he goes after the Philistines. And then he becomes a personal enemy of them. He has this extraordinary strength and a red cape. No, I added that. And then there's one case that says where he goes to the city of Gaza, which is right where Gaza is today, and that's a Philistine city, and he stays with a prostitute in Gaza, and the Philistines hear he's in town, so they surround the city, and to show them that he's not really afraid of that sort of thing, he lifts up the entire gate of Gaza and carries it on his back, it says, to the hills of Judah. That is to say, around where Jerusalem is. That's uphill. That's many miles. That's the width of the country. And a city gate is like, from here to there. So he's carrying this thing, which is his way of saying, do you really want it with me? And then he meets this woman, Delilah, Hedy Lamarr. I like the Hedy Lamarr Delilah. Some of you may prefer the Elizabeth Hurley Hedy Lamarr. There have been several. The Elizabeth Hurley Delilah, not the Elizabeth Hurley Hedy Lamarr. Delilah, people always assume is a Philistine woman. The fact is she could be an Israelite woman. She could be an anything woman. It never tells you what her background is. All we know is she's persuaded to uncover the secret of Samson's strength for the Philistines, which she does, and it's the hair, and then I can give you this is a great trick to make money and work your way through college. You bet people that it wasn't Delilah who cut Samson's hair in the Bible. Everybody remembers it that way, that it was Delilah who cut Samson's hair. So you bet them. It works better if you pretend to be drunk so they think you're confused. And you bet, no, it wasn't Delilah. And then you pull out a Bible and you have the verse in Judges ready. And it says, and then she called a man, and he cut his hair. It never says who it is who cuts Samson's hair. It just tells you who it wasn't. It wasn't Delilah. And I like to help students. I realize these are hard times. You need money to get through college, so I teach you ways to cheat other people. And that results in his being blinded and chained and imprisoned in a mill, not in a prison. And then one day when the Philistines have him there, they're going to mock him at the temple of Dagon, he brings down the whole temple. And in the movies, they always have this really interesting thing where they try to figure out how just pushing down 2 columns will bring down an entire building. But in the movie, in the what do you call it? Victor Mature. You had somebody named Victor Mature to play Samson, Hedy Lamarr version. He brings down the whole building. And that is to say, in his life, everything that happens to him is moved by the events of his life. It starts at a drinking party, a banquet, when he finds out about his wife, and there's this silly riddle about a lion and all this, that all starts it, and then it's the connections with the women, and then it's these battles that he has, killing 1,000 men with the jawbone of an ass, which, by the way, is a very impressive. If you've ever seen the jawbone of an ass, it's not as unusual as you'd think, but still, 1 against 1,000 is, impressive, and Gurley could do it, but you see how desperately I try to keep things relevant around here? So you lose track in the story of whether this is the hand of God making all this happen, because remember, all the terms were set while he's still in the womb. He's only a fetus. And then all the great fetus that he accomplishes are the result of this structure. So, and yet he makes these decisions himself too, who he's going to marry and who he's going to sleep with and all of that. But and that's what makes all those things happen. So we refer to this as dual causation. Dual causation. The things are both caused by the humans in the story themselves, and you suspect that there's some higher force conducting them and making them happen as well. And it's hard to separate the two out and say, well, when is this the hand of God and when is this the human choice? The next story after the Samson case is about the priesthood of the tribe of Dan, which is the northernmost city in Israel. And now we're starting to lose the judges aspect. It's not at all clear whether Samson should count as a judge or not, and that's the longest single unit in the book of Judges. It's several chapters long. And then the story of Dan is in the the chapter 18. And the story there is this man has an ephod and an idol. An ephod is presumably it's like a garment, usually linen, that is placed on an idol to wear. So that then when sometimes the priest puts the ephod on, that's a very powerful image for the people and effective. So for example, you may know in Greece there was this city called Athens. And it was called Athens because the chief deity of the city of Athens was the goddess Athena. And her temple, the Parthenon, was where she was worshipped. And there was a giant statue of Athena. It's a terrible, sad story. I'm sorry to tell you that one, but it's awful. There's this giant statue of Athena in there, and once a year they would have the giant Pan-Athenaic procession, and they would march up and they would take the dress off of the idol of Athena and put a new dress on it. And again, the idol isn't the god, goddess in this case. Athena is the goddess elsewhere, but it's a statue of her. And so in ancient Near East, too, you could wear an ephod, which would be the outfit on the idol. So this guy has these things, and he meets a guy going along, and the guy's traveling. The guy is a Levite. He says, "Oh, you're a Levite. That's great. You'll be my priest here." So he's this wealthy guy. He's got this idol and his ephod, and he has this guy function as his priest. But then the tribe of Dan comes along, and they originally were supposed to have their territory farther south, but they're migrating looking for a territory, so they're moving north, and they see this house, and it's got the idol and the ephod and the priest, and they go, "Oh, that's great, we could have a tribal priest." So they take this guy with him as their priest, and they indicate to the guy who owns the house, "If you come after us, we'll kill you." And then he goes, "Yeah, right, he's your priest, he's your priest." And they go, and it says, "And this man and his descendants after him were the priests of the tribe of Dan until the destruction of Israel, which came hundreds of years later." So for hundreds of years, you've got to remember that there's this family of Levites, right? The Levites are the priestly tribe, and they're up there functioning as priests. Now, who are they? It gives the man's name, and that's what I want you to look at. It's in Judges 18, verse 30. It's right at the end of Judges 18. And there it gives his name. So it says, the Danites set up the idol, and here's his name. Who was their priest? Jonathan son of Gershom, son of, and then what do you have? Anybody? Manasseh?
I have Moses.
Moses? Moses, Manasseh? Well, which is it? Okay, how would you write? Remember, in Hebrew, there's only consonants, right? So that would be Hebrew, right? That would be Moshe, Moses. Or the letter N, Hebrew Nun, or that would be Manasseh. Now, if you look, whether it's in a printed Hebrew text like I have here, or if you actually look like on the Leningrad Codex which is written by hand on the pages, whether it's by hand or by print, they print it with the letter Nun, the N, suspended. And there is a footnote that was put in medieval times that says in Hebrew Nun Teluya, which means suspended Nun. And you go, what happened here? Is it that the original text was Moses, meaning he's the grandson of Moses, right? What was Moses' son's name? Usually written Gershon with an N, but close enough. There's Gershom and there's Gershonites in the Bible, so there's an overlap among the Levites. But Moses' son's name is this, and then there's this. So was it originally Moshe, and some scribes said, oh no, that can't be right. Moses' grandson wouldn't be a priest. The priests, it turn out later, are only the descendants of Aaron, but we don't know that yet. And so he says it must be Manasseh, so he puts in an N. Or is it that the original was Manasseh, and somebody wrote Moses by mistake, because Moses is more famous and it's one letter difference, so he writes Moses, and then goes back, he goes, oh, left out my N. So it goes back. So either way, you've all done this where you squeeze a letter in, if you still ever write anything with a pen or a pencil, So what are we supposed to do to figure out which one is right? You could look at other sources. In the Greek text, it says Musas, Moses. So on the evidence of the Greek, and that this would take place about 2 generations after Moses, and this is his son's name, the far more likely reading is you have descendants of Moses who are the priests of Don. I mean, if you were Moses' grandson, what would you do for a living? I grew up in Miami Beach, where the mayor was Elliott Roosevelt. He actually went with a band playing Happy Days Are Here Again in Miami Beach, where there are these old people, everybody in Miami Beach, it's God's waiting room. It's the elephant's burial ground. It's where old retired people go to visit their parents. It's Miami Beach. And he goes there in the 1970s with a band playing Happy Days Are Here Again. That was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's theme song in his election. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the president of the United States in the 1940s, the only president to serve 4 terms, 3.5. He died during the 4th term. And Elliott said, the people of Miami Beach are not going to vote for me because my name is Roosevelt. That will hurt me. The people of Miami Beach are going to vote for me because I offer them a new deal. He really did that. So then that was the grandson of Moses, apparently. Or else it is some Manasseh, and it's an unknown Manasseh, because there's like 2 other guys in the Bible named Manasseh, so, But I want you to remember that guy, that there are priests. We call them Mushite priests, meaning descendants of Moses. We could call them Mosaic priests, but then everybody would think it's those little stone things. And then there's one last story. It's the last few chapters, Judges 19 through 21, which, especially starting in Judges 19, is curious. In Judges 19, it says that there's this man who comes from Judah. Now remember, Judah is still a separate country from Israel at this point. Remember, it was just down in the south. And he is traveling with his concubine and his servant, and he comes to this town, Gibeon, and a man puts him up in his house, and the people of the town surround the house and say, "Send him out that we may know him." And the guy says, "Don't do wrong, my brothers." And you're listening, almost every word of this story is the same as in Genesis 19. They even numbered them the same. No, that happened by coincidence. Genesis 19 and Judges 19. Coincidence? And the people surround the house, and this time, instead of having a couple of angels to save them, the guy takes his concubine and he pushes her out the door. And the crowd takes her and rape her all night, and he finds her dead on the doorstep in the morning. It is one of the most horrible stories in the Bible, and so different from, the outcome is different from what happened in the Genesis story. But if you look, not only is it the same steps in the story, but they all keep saying the same words, which we'd have to explain somehow. And the result is the guy takes his concubine and he cuts her up into enough pieces to send out to all the tribes of Israel, parts of her body. And it's a summons to everybody saying, symbolically, may this be done to you if you don't help us. And they all come, and there's an internal war in Israel of the tribe of Benjamin, the most warlike tribe, against all the others. And then this leads to all kinds of disasters that, follow it out in the end, it becomes pretty bad. All these women get taken, and none of this has anything to do with Judges, but the title is on the book. That shouldn't bother you. The next two books we're going to read are 1 and 2 Samuel. Samuel dies in 1 Samuel. So the second book is called 2 Samuel, and there's no Samuel. He's been dead for a long time in there, but they call it that. It's okay. Presumably, there is actually research on this, because there's research on everything on the Bible. There are people who've done research just on scroll length. What is the maximum length a scroll can be? Because, after a while, it's all rolled up, and especially if you have it on only one roller, one spine, instead of the way they do a Torah in a synagogue, which is like two rolls, that gets wider and wider and wider the longer the book is, and harder to find anything, harder to carry, and so on. And so there's actually a maximum length that a scroll can be. And it's about the length of 1 Samuel. That is to say, to put 1 and 2 Samuel all on one scroll just didn't work. That's why you have 1 and 2 Chronicles. That's why you have 1 and 2 Kings in the Bible, because they don't make it all onto one scroll. That's the argument, anyway. So the fact that it's 1 and 2 really don't mean a thing. So let's now, knowing that, let's turn to 1 and 2 Samuel. Today we're working on 1 Samuel. Who is this Samuel? He's the last of the judges. Israel's been ruled by these judges. He is a judge, but he's a Nazirite who apparently comes to function as the high priest of Israel, which shouldn't happen. Only a Levite should be a priest, but he is. So it seems to be that we have a case here of a Nazirite who can rise all the way to priest. You notice he, again, is not a typical Nazirite. So the only two Nazirites we get in the Bible, Samson and Samuel, are not Nazirites according to the rules of the book of Numbers, which says you become a Nazirite, which is this vow and a sacrifice and all that. He is the same as Samson. He's going to be a Nazirite from the womb. And it turns out he's able to prophesy as well. So he is everything that's been the leadership and now has been judges, priests, and prophets. He's all three. It's crucial that he's all three because he's going to anoint the first king of Israel. And so the transfer of power had to come from everything that's been power until now, accepting that this is going to be the king of Israel. So he's dedicated before birth, and the story you should look at carefully. His mother's this woman named Hannah. She and Peninnah are both married to the same man. And what a surprise. He loves Hannah more, so the sister, Peninnah, has all the children, and she doesn't have any. It's the same as stories we saw like with Sarah and Rachel and Leah, that the score is evened between the more loved and the less loved wife. And so she goes to the temple, which apparently at this point is at the city of Shiloh. Get this, because almost everybody says this wrong. When you say to anybody in ancient Israel, what's the first temple, the second temple? They say the first temple is the one that King Solomon built in Jerusalem. We'll get to that. And the second temple was built later, which we'll come to also, and that was also in Jerusalem. Well, that's not true. The first temple is at Shiloh. It's explicit in the book of Samuel. That's where the temple is. Shiloh's a city in the north. And everybody just forgets it. They just remember the two Jerusalem temples. So there haven't been just two, there have been three. I think we should make a fourth. I think we need to build a fourth temple. Apparently only I and extreme ultra-Orthodox Jews think this. And people say, how can you build a temple? There's a mosque sitting on the spot now. And I say, put it somewhere else. Is this too hard a thought for everybody? The first one was at Shiloh. The second and third were in Jerusalem. The fourth one can be anywhere as long as it has to be in Israel. That's clear. You know, Miami would have worked better. There's more Jews there anyway. But, so Hannah goes to the temple at Shiloh, and it says that she's praying for a son. And she prays to God and says, if you'll give me a son, I'll give him to you, the service of you his whole life. And the priest there is the old priest Eli, Hebrew Eli. And Eli sees her, just sees her lips moving and no sound coming out. And he doesn't understand that she's praying, which is a little strange that the high priest doesn't understand that a person standing at the entrance of a temple going, just might be praying. But he says to her, woman, when will you put away your wine? So he falsely accuses her of drunkenness. And she says, no, I was praying for something. I'm a bitter-souled woman, she said, and I was praying for something. And now he's embarrassed because he misread her. And he says, all right, then go, and whatever you prayed for, may God grant you that. Uh-oh. So she goes, and sure enough, what she prayed for was a son, and when he's a little older and weaned and all, she brings him back to the temple at Shiloh, and she says, well, here he is. And Eli says, what? And she says, this is what I prayed for that day. And you said, may God make that happen. Well, I prayed to be this kid and that I would give him the service of God forever. So now there it is. Samuel is to grow up as a Nazirite and will be the successor of Eli as the priest. Because as he's growing up, everybody sees this quality that he has. Maybe it's the same as the charisma we talked about in the case of other judges. Everybody sees Samuel and they know this kid's special. And meanwhile, the Philistine power is growing. Now remember, the Philistines are down here in the region that is still to this day Gaza. That's here along the coast. And the Philistines are thought to have been, they came from the Greek islands or from Cyprus or from, people argue from where, but they came across the Mediterranean. So they were outsiders who came. They accepted Dagon, the local god, as their chief god, and basically accepted the pagan religion of the region. And the Philistines had iron. The Israelites had bronze. If you want to know what happens when a guy with an iron sword fights a guy with a bronze sword, there's a movie called The Egyptian. Peter Ustinov, Edmund Purdom, Gene Simmons, Victor Mature. It's supposed to be the story of the Egyptian monotheistic pharaoh Akhenaten, but it's a lot mixed in. It's one of those costume dramas that they did in Hollywood in the late 50s. But in it, the hero, he goes up to the Hittites who had iron, and he brings back an iron sword to show Haremhab, Victor Mature, who's the general and future pharaoh of Egypt. And he says, strike at me with your sword. And he holds up his iron sword, and Haremhab strikes with his bronze sword, and he hits it, and there's like a little gash in the bronze sword. And he says, no, strike me harder. And Haremhab really whacks him with the bronze sword, and it just cuts in half against the iron sword. So you've got a picture in human history, understand the significance of metals and why we call it the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. We use those as the terms. Those got to be the terms because they were that important. Like today will be whatever the technology age, or we name things after extraordinary changes, things that change everything. Like refrigeration and J.K. Rowling and stuff like that. You got to picture the first time there really was a battle where one side had iron swords and the other side had bronze swords, and all these bronze swords they're going whack. I'm going to die. I mean, it was like that. And so the Philistines are dominating the Israelites. And there's a battle, and they not only defeat the Israelites, but Eli's sons, the priests, have brought the ark to be on the Israelite side in the battle. The ark, you remember, with the tablets and all that. And they are both killed, and the ark is captured. And when their father Eli hears about it, he's an old man, he falls over backwards in his chair and dies. And the ark is placed inside the temple of Dagon, and that was a passage I read you on the first day of this course, the story of what happens when the ark is in the temple of Dagon. And then because these things that happen, where they find the statue of Dagon bowing in front of the ark, and then it says that God plagues the Philistines with hemorrhoids. The story is told with a certain element of humor in it, though if any of you have ever had hemorrhoids, there's nothing funny about hemorrhoids except the location. And so the Philistines now realize that they are the butt of the Israelites' jokes, and they, in the King James, it's the emerods. And when I used to read that, I had no idea what emerods were, but they're, boils, hemorrhoids. And so they send the ark back with statues, with these idols, or I don't know, just sculptures of little golden mice and little golden hemorrhoids. I'm not quite sure what the Israelites were expected to do with little golden paperweight. What you have an idea here,
Jacob? I don't think it was hemorrhoids. I think it was buboes from bubonic plague.
Oh.
And the mice would be fitting for that because the mice.
Mice bring bubonic plague.
And, yeah.
Oh. Well, I have to admit that is more consistent.
Yeah. I think hemorrhoid is a weird translation personally, but I guess we just don't know what it is.
Well, hemorrhoids isn't as weird as emerods. But
still, what do you do with golden like oils?
those also are, paperweights. Yeah. Of course, they didn't have paper, but that's a separate matter. It was prophetic. So the people of Israel are finally fed up with this, and they want a king. They give two reasons why they want a king to Samuel. And now we start to realize that this whole story, since the death of Moses, has been who's in charge here, is the story. Especially after Joshua. From the time the people are settled in the land, it's who's in charge here. The fact that initially it was Deborah, and apparently we have spent 3,000 years burying that fact so people wouldn't realize that this country, Israel, began with a female leader. And then there was that Abimelech, who his father Gideon apparently had said, I will not be king over you, and my son will not be king over you, but then he makes himself king, and it doesn't work, and he's killed. And now you've got Samuel, and the people come and say, hey, they want a king, and he tries the old, you have a king, God is your king, you don't get a human king thing. But that doesn't work. And it says that God tells Samuel, even after Samuel's already said to people, no, you can't have a king, only God is your king, which means he himself is the ruler, you understand. There's no separating politics from religion. Of course, nowadays the two are completely separate. But in those days, there was no separating politics from religion. And so God says to Samuel, go ahead, give them what they ask for. He says, because it's not you they've rejected, it's me they've rejected. Now, for the rest of the story, which is going to be the next few books of the Bible, which are all about kings, you have to understand that the idea of kings in Israel was always this mixed deal. That on the one hand, it's explicitly saying to have a king is to reject God. And on the other hand, the kings are heroes, King David, and the messiahs come from all that. We're going to get to all of that. There's a very positive thing about kings. When you read in the book of Kings about all of them, when you read in the books of Samuel about the first kings, Saul and David, you'll see that they're mixed about the kings as well. But some of them are regarded as great. The majority, you'll see, are rated bad in the eyes of Yahweh. They rate all the kings. Good in the eyes of Yahweh, bad in the eyes of Yahweh. And all but 6 or 7, was it, are rated bad in the eyes of Yahweh. And of those, only 2 get like a completely good rating. Whereas, no, he was really good. There was no king like him. Only 2. And they come for a long time from now. So the people want a king, and they give 2 reasons. 1, so that we may be like all the nations. When everybody else has a king, that is the cool, modern, civilized, sophisticated thing to do. And you're like a bunch of hicks if you don't have one. They want to be like all the other nations. And the second, they say, is so he'll go out and fight our wars for us. And that's always been a primary thing. I mean, the President of the United States, his first task is he's commander-in-chief of the military. And several times in American history, generals became presidents of the U.S., including our first president, whose success as a general did it, including President Eisenhower, who was the first president, the second president I remember of my lifetime. I still remember Harry Truman. He was maybe the best president of my lifetime. And he liked to cuss. I like that. And I mean publicly. They all cuss. He cussed publicly. And, Andrew Jackson and Grant, not our favorite president here in the South, and Eisenhower, and none lately. But they need a king then who'll be their military leader and relieve them of the Philistine power. And so he appoints Saul, who comes from the tribe of Benjamin. On the one hand, that's the smallest tribe. But on the other hand, it is the military tribe, as we've discussed before. They're the ones who train all the kids to be bound with their right hands so that they're ambidextrous. And at the anointment of Saul, Samuel, the prophet, judge, priest, says, as he anoints him, he says, "You have this day rejected your God," which kind of puts a damper on the occasion for Saul. I always wondered, if you're the president of the United States puts his hand on a Bible, his or her hand on a Bible, and swears the oath of presidency. And imagine right after that, if the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is just sworn in, the president would look out at the entire audience, the American people, and says, "You have this day rejected your God." I mean, that would kind of mess up the ball that night, So he's the one who's anointed. Now this thing to anoint, right, that means to pour oil on the head. I actually am old enough that I remember the anointing of Queen Elizabeth II. She is now, right, reigned through, 7 or 8 prime ministers of England. And so it's been a while. It was in the 1950s when I was a kid that she was anointed the Queen of England. And they pour oil on the head, and that's called anointing. Now, how do you say this in Hebrew? It's the Hebrew verb mashach. Mashach, to anoint with oil. Or, as we pronounce it in English, that is what the word Messiah means, the anointed. It's the King of Israel is anointed. Anybody know how you say that in Greek? Yeah, I know you know. Nobody knows how you say Messiah in Greek? Why is it that Christianity is the biggest religion in the world and most Christians don't know what the name of their religion means? If you ask people what does the word Christ mean, the most common answer you get is Savior, which is just wrong. It's okay, most Jews don't know what the word rabbi means, so what the heck, you know. But Christos means anointed. It's the term for the king. Saul is called remember, if you're reading this book in the Greek, not the Hebrew, Saul is called the Christos, the Christ. David is called the Christos. And you can't really understand what people expected in Jesus' time and understand your New Testament unless you have that background of understanding what the term means. So there are two stories of how Saul gets to be the king, and this is curious because I want you to watch as you read 1 Samuel how many times there are two stories of something. That's called a doublet. I know a doublet is a thing that Hamlet wears and all that, but a doublet is when you have two never identical but very similar stories. So there's two stories of how he got to be the king. There's the story of the asses and the story of the lottery. The first is Saul is told by his father that their asses are missing and that he should go find them. So he goes with a servant, and they're traveling all over Israel. And finally the servant says, you know, we should go up to Shiloh because there's that guy Samuel there, and he's a prophet. So he'll tell us where the asses are. So Saul and his servant go to Shiloh to ask Samuel where the asses are. But meanwhile, the night before, God has told Samuel, tomorrow I'm going to show you the guy I picked to be king. You'll know him when you see him. And Saul comes up and he says, I'm looking for my father's asses. And Samuel says, I'll tell you where the asses are, and also, by the way, you're the king of Israel. That's one story. Then there's a second story, which is they hold a lottery. It's the national lottery. And they put in the names of all the tribes, and then they pull out all the tribes and they go, Benjamin, is Benjamin here? And then they take all the clans in Benjamin, and they pull out the right clan of Benjamin. Then they put all the family heads in that one, and they put Kish. Is the family of Kish here? Okay, and then they put the names of all the sons of Kish in the thing, and they pull out Saul. Do we have Saul? Saul, you're the king, and the trip to Hawaii, and the bicycle, and, you know. So we understand that lotteries are a serious matter in the Bible. They're understood to reveal the divine will. Because there will be other stories we'll read where a lottery figures like that. Well, you've already read in the story of Achan, the one who stole property from the city of Jericho, and they did a lottery to decide who was the one who had done it. And sure enough, the lottery reveals the real person. So then it says, the Spirit of God came over Saul, and he cuts up these oxen and sends them around and does the same thing that guy did at Gibeon with his concubine. You send around a cut up thing, and it's saying to everybody, this is what's going to happen to you if you're not with me. And so he goes and fights the Philistines. The term Spirit of God came upon him. You have to be careful. You may have noticed in the book of Judges, every now and then it has that expression, the Spirit of God came over him. There was a piece of scholarship done about the story of Jephthah's daughter. Remember, he made this vow to God that if he wins, he'll sacrifice the first thing that comes out, and the daughter comes out, so he sacrifices her. And this piece argued that the reason for the death of the girl then was the lack of faith of the father. Because if the opening of the story said the Spirit of God came over him, well, if the Spirit of God already came over you, you shouldn't have to make any promises and deals with God that if he gives you a victory, you'll do that. And the person who wrote that article simply didn't understand what the term Spirit of God came over you. It doesn't mean that when the Spirit of God comes over you, your face glows, you know, or the teacups rattle on your mantelpiece. You know, it's not a woo kind of thing. Spirit of God came over you, it means you won. It means, you know, you were inspired, you were successful. It doesn't mean anything spooky. And the Spirit of God can come over you, and you don't know that the Spirit of God came over you. You find out when you win the battle, and you go, oh yeah, Spirit of God came over me. Notice football players never say the Spirit of God came over me at the beginning of the game. They say it if they won. At the end of the game, if you lost, you look stupid saying, you know, how do you think you lost this game? Well, the Spirit of God came over me. I mean, it just doesn't work. So then, too, Spirit of God came over means he won. So now everything is great, right? No, because this has been a question of who's in charge here, who's the leader. And so now you've got a situation where Samuel is still around, and he's a priest, a prophet, and a judge. And now Saul's around, and he's a king and a general. And sure enough, they run into conflict. And again, there are two different stories of what the conflict is. The first one is the story of Saul's sacrifice. It says that Samuel tells him, go fight the Philistines and take no prisoners. So it is like a holy war where he's supposed to defeat and kill at least all the Philistine army. And Saul is getting ready to go fight the battle against the Philistines, and Samuel hasn't shown up yet, and he doesn't want to go into battle without offering a sacrifice to God first. So he's waiting for Samuel, waiting. Samuel doesn't come, so Saul offers the sacrifice himself. Big mistake. He offers the sacrifice himself. Now he's stepping into Samuel's prerogatives. He's doing the thing that only a priest should be doing. And that's dangerous. Now he's a threat. As a biblical scholar, I've been asked many times by people to do weddings for them. And I always said, no, I won't perform a wedding because I won't perform a wedding because I don't want to be like a threat to rabbis. I want them to understand that I am not setting foot in their territory. I have a different job. I'm a scholar. They are clergy. I don't do weddings. Until my stepson asked me to do his wedding. So I did it. And then I was talking to a rabbi friend of mine. I said, I did a wedding. I said, I was so nervous doing a wedding that my hand was shaking that I'd spill the wine on the bride's gown. Did I tell you all this story already? It just comes to me like I've told it. I do that a lot lately. It's deja vu all over again. And I said, I was afraid I would spill the wine on her gown. And he said to me, you used red wine at a wedding? And I go, oh, I didn't know that. Rabbis who perform weddings, probably the Jewish weddings, the bride and groom each drink from a cup, a common cup. So if either has herpes, the other one, no. I didn't know you're supposed to use white wine in case you spill it on the bride. But if you've been performing weddings for 20 years, you know that one. You know, you learned that one in seminary. So that's the lesson I learned. And that's the one and only wedding I will ever do. So all the rabbis, all the ministers, they can all feel safe. I'll never mess with their zone. But Saul did. He offers the sacrifice, and Samuel rejects him for that as king of Israel. The other story is a different one. He's not against the Philistines, he's against the Amalekites. Who are Amalekites? Remember, they're the descendants of Amalek. Who is Amalek? Son of Esau. People forget this. The Amalekites are a subgroup of the Edomites, who are the descendants of Esau. Edom is over here in the southern part of what is today Jordan. And the Amalekites are somewhere out there. They attack Israel in the wilderness, there's a story, and there's a cherem forever on the Amalekites. If today this door opens and an Amalekite lady wheels her Amalekite baby into the room, I'm supposed to kill them. Fortunately for her and me, we don't know anymore if there are any Amalekites left or who they are or where they are. That's really good news. And so he's going to do this holy war thing against the Amalekites. Now remember, that means you're supposed to kill everybody and take no spoil, even the animals. But Samuel violates this in two ways. He does kill everybody in the army, but he does not kill the king of the Amalekites. Now, it doesn't say why he doesn't kill the king of the Amalekites, but you can understand that there's kind of a rule. Kings, in a sense, all have more in common with each other, even with their enemy kings. They have more in common with each other than they do with their own people. And this is harder for us as Americans to understand because we don't have kings. In Europe, they all get this real clear, that all kings are members of the King's Club, you know? King Clubs, King of Hearts, they're all members of the same club. And they have an understanding with each other normally, like, if I win, I won't kill you, because then if you win, you don't kill me. And the exceptions of that in history, where you read about kings who were willing to kill, often very painfully, other kings, they were putting themselves at great risk because they were saying, this could happen to me. And it's said that Queen Elizabeth I, whose anointment I did not see, except in a Bette Davis movie, or no, who played her most recently? She's wonderful. Kate Blanchett, wonderful. She was great Elizabeth. That Queen Elizabeth I, it is said that after the day she chopped off her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots' head, she never had a good night's sleep after that because she had set the precedent that queens can be killed. And so he keeps the king alive, and he takes all the animals as spoil, which he wasn't supposed to do. And then Samuel shows up. And Samuel says, what's going on here? And Saul says, I've been really zealous for the Lord. I did this great number on the Philistines. And Samuel says, if you've been zealous for the Lord, what meaneth this bleating of sheep I hear in mine ears? Is the King James translation of that. And Saul, always quick with an answer, says, sacrifices. I saved the sheep so we could offer sacrifices. And Samuel says this line that be crucial line to remember. He says, does Yahweh desire offerings and sacrifices as much as listening to the voice of Yahweh? Listening is better than a sacrifice. Obeying is better than the fat of rams. Now you notice that's an oracle because he went into poetry. Parallel. Listening is better than sacrifice. Obeying is better than the fat of rams. And that becomes the watchword of other prophets you'll read in the Bible. And a lot of people misunderstand. They take this to mean that the prophets were against sacrifice. The prophets aren't against sacrifice. If you want to eat meat, you're supposed to do it by way of a sacrifice. The prophets are not vegetarians. The prophets are against meaningless sacrifice. And they say that they're against that. And that you can't do sacrifice and think that that makes up for it. It's the same as today a priest or a minister or a rabbi saying, don't think that you can sin all week and then bring a donation to the church and then it's all okay. So they're saying sacrifice is not a substitute for behavior. And then it says Samuel never again comes to see Saul. He mourns Saul as if he's dead. And the text then says, Yahweh regretted that he had made Saul king, which tells you already Saul's on the way out. And this introduces David, who becomes the next great hero. Now the weird thing is, on this David business, there are more of these doublets. We've already had a couple. If you count them in this, it's strange. In the David story, there are two different stories about how Saul and David meet. In one of them, it says that Saul has migraines, apparently terrible headaches. And they find him this harp player, David, who's really good at the harp and singing. And he does this for Saul, and it calms him down and helps his headaches. This was before Advil. In this period. And not that funny, huh? Tylenol, before Tylenol? Midol? So he helps Saul, and he becomes Saul's armor bearer. An armor bearer, by the way, doesn't mean like a little kid who carries, it's a warrior. He's the warrior who fights next to the king. And that's one story of how they meet. But then there's the second story. It says that the Philistines have this man Goliath who is a giant. Now this matters because at the beginning of our story in Genesis, right, there was a story in Genesis 6 that we went over where the male gods have sex with human women and they give birth to these creatures who are like half divine, half human, apparently. They're giants. And then they're not mentioned again after Genesis 6 until Numbers chapters 13 and 14, the story of when Moses sends the spies into the land. And the spies come back and they said, we saw these giants. The Rephaim, the Anakim, this Hebrew terms for giants in the land. These are the descendants of those guys who you hadn't heard about since Genesis 6. And then in the book of Joshua, it says that Joshua defeats and kills all of the giants except from 3 cities. And one of the three cities, all three of them are Philistine cities, and one of them is Gath. And now it tells you there's this giant man named Goliath, and he is from the city of Gath. So something that started in Genesis and continued in Numbers and then continued in Joshua now reaches its culmination. The last of the great giants is Goliath. And you know what's going to happen to him. Yeah.
Isn't there a flood in there somewhere?
I wondered about that too. If there were these giants, right, they're not descended from Seth, of the line of Adam and Eve. Therefore, like the descendants of Cain, there shouldn't be any. Like I said, there shouldn't be any Cainites, but there are. And there shouldn't be any giants. I can't figure out the Cainites, but I figure with the giants, it's that they were tall enough that they could, you know. How are you doing? Well, man, keep, you know. Plot mistake, complication. I can explain it, but not until lecture 19.
Well, there's no reason the sons of God stopped going down to the daughters of men just because the flood happened.
Oh. There is, but you don't get that until lecture 24, so, you know. But I'm not making up those numbers. That's really when we're going to deal with those things. It's how I keep people in the course, you know. Nobody ever dropped my course. Yeah, because you cheat, you know. So in this story, no Israelite will dare fight against Goliath, the champion of the Philistines. And so isn't there anyone who will do it? And meanwhile, the youngest of 7 brothers in this family, David, comes to see his brothers. They're all in the army. He's too young. And he comes to bring them messages from home and all that sort of thing, and, you know, packages. And he hears this Goliath insulting the people, and he says, why do we allow this, and in your English translation it's like, why do we allow this uncircumcised one to taunt us? Right? Because the Philistines are from Greece. They are uncircumcised, and the Israelites locally are circumcised. But you got to understand, the word he uses there can mean like an uncircumcised person, but the word actually, it means a foreskin. It means the part that's cut off. So it's even worse than like in our world if you call a guy, pick your word. If you call a guy any of those not nice words for the male organ as a way of insulting him, think of what it means to call a guy a foreskin, you know, especially in a world where they really valued circumcision. He's saying he's not even he's the part you threw away from, you got it, I've covered that enough. So that's what he calls Goliath. And he goes out to fight him. And but when he does this, where he volunteers, Saul says, who is this? You know, that he's going to go out and fight. And you're like, what do you mean, who is this? He's your armor bearer. He plays the harp for you every night. You know him. But here he seems not to know him. Now, you could say, no, he just means it as a, who are you? Like you might say to someone you know. But it's a little weird, and it's another one of these stories. There's 2 different stories of where Saul chucks a spear at David. He finally can't take it anymore because he's threatened by David, so he throws a spear at him and David escapes. There are 2 stories of where Saul is sleeping and David has a chance to kill him, but he doesn't because he says, I won't lay a hand on the Mashiach of Yahweh. And again, in the Greek, I wouldn't lay a hand on the Christ of God, the Messiah. There are 2 stories where Saul kind of gets crazy and accomplishes something. He does wild stuff against the Philistines, and people say, is Saul among the prophets? And apparently, is Saul among the prophets an expression that was known in ancient Israel, where you see somebody do something you never would have expected from that person. And you go, is Saul among the prophets? Because Saul isn't a king, isn't a prophet. I mean, so there's 2 different stories of what that means. And there's 2 different stories of how David allies with the king of Gath. For a while, it turns that David is an enemy of Israel, and he's a retainer of the Philistines, and you're unclear if he's doing that like as a spy kind of thing, or because he's just aligning with the Philistines, because Israel, the king, has turned against him. Who is this David? He comes from the city of Bethlehem, which is about there. It's a little not far from Jerusalem. We know the town already. It's the place where Rachel is buried back in Genesis. You can go to Bethlehem today. I think I've told you, and there's a tomb there that they tell you is the tomb of Rachel. And if you believe that, that's fine. There's equal likelihood that this room is the tomb of Rachel. David comes from Bethlehem, and he comes from Judah. Now, you know, most of this story now, Judah has been separate from all the rest of Israel. There's Judah, which is the whole southern half. It's from here, from like the top of the Dead Sea, down to the top of, from the top of the Dead Sea to the top of the eastern arm of the Red Sea. All of that is Judah. And everything above it is the tribes of Israel. And so he being from Judah has not been, no one from Judah has been part of the story until now. And now he seems to be, he and his brothers, they're all allied with King Saul and fighting with Israel. So understand that, though, that this is different, because when I said Saul came from Benjamin, Benjamin is right around the middle. In this zone here, like right on the line between Judah and Israel, and it's the smallest of the tribes. Judah is by far the largest. It's almost as big as all the others put together. So it's a big difference having a leader from Judah than having a leader from Benjamin. And the tribe of Simeon was somewhere in the middle of Judah, but it just disappeared. It got eaten up by Judah. And if you look at a map of where the tribes were, you won't even see Simeon on the map. So David becomes a big hero, and the women are singing outside Saul's window. And they're singing the song that goes, I don't know the tune, because it doesn't give you the notes in the book, but Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And remember, in biblical Hebrew poetry, there's always parallels. So there's a parallel. Saul has slain thousands, David 10,000s. And Saul says, oh, they give him the 10,000s and I get the thousands? He doesn't like that. So more and more he now realizes that David's more popular than he is, and he's threatened by him. And what we're going to see now is the transition in kingship from Saul to David, and then that will conclude the book of 1 Samuel. And then when you come to 2 Samuel, the entire book is going to be about the question, who is the successor of David? So first it's the question of who's the king, and then when you get David as the king, should I have given away that he was going to win? David will be the king. And then the question is, of the whole book of 2 Samuel is the succession. Who's going to be the next king after David? And you watch all the stuff that happens among his sons, and you'll read it and you'll never want to have children. I mean, it's like, it's go try and raise a family. It does not work.